Hello everyone, I am William Jamar Wright.
And I'm Hattie.
And welcome to our podcast, What Are We Doing? And it is December, and so we are wishing everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy Holidays. But we're also finishing off our last month of the Emotions series.
That's right.
Yeah. So,
not only is it December, it is December 24th.
Yes.
Christmas Eve. As you can see, I'm all decked out in my Christmas gear. We're sipping hot chocolate and we're just enjoying the day off, the holidays.
Yep, definitely enjoying the holidays. So for this last episode on emotions, I thought we would talk about emotional intelligence because that is definitely just something that is very intriguing to me, and just thinking about kind of what do you think about when people say emotional intelligence?
I will say when I was younger, like a child, I didn't really get it. As a child, I had heard about, your IQ, your intelligence quotient, it's this number that indicates how, I was about to say how smart you are, but I don't think that's quite right. I think smartness is how much knowledge and education you have, whereas intelligence is an innate ability, right? Someone that's, let's say, raised in the wild, never met another human in their life, could still have really high intelligence, even though they wouldn't have a lot of education or in a civilized society knowledge that we might term knowledge, right? So I think those two things are different, but I'm getting on a tangent. So anyway, as a kid, I had heard about that, and I also felt through my own life experience, I could understand, when you interact with someone that you feel has a high amount of intelligence, and then someone that doesn't have a high amount of intelligence, you can kind of pick up on that. So that all made sense to me, but the emotional intelligence, I didn't really understand, and it wasn't until I was an adult and I felt like I truly started to understand a little bit more of, there's that same thing where you can talk to someone that's really highly emotionally intelligent and you can talk to someone that's not emotionally intelligent, and you can definitely tell, right? And there's tangible, it's when you interact with them. You're looking at me all shocked.
Well, I never...
So I guess what I'm trying to say is I didn't appreciate it until I was an adult, but I very much believe that there are multiple types of intelligence, and one dimension of that is on the emotional responses of being attuned to emotional
Yeah, I guess states. I never really thought of it that way. I always, I never think of, when I think of emotional intelligence, I never think about being able to, somebody else's emotional intelligence. I always think about emotional intelligence as, am I emotionally intelligent? I don't really, other people, maybe you're emotionally intelligent, maybe you're not. I don't feel like I know anyone well enough to know if they're emotionally intelligent or not. I feel like that's,
Well, I also think this is interesting because I would classify you as a very highly emotionally intelligent person, and I would classify myself, I would like to think I'm above average. Maybe that's not really true. I definitely have noticeably had thoughts to myself of maybe I'm not the most emotionally intelligent person that there is. And sometimes that's based on feedback I receive from other people. Sometimes that's based on observations that I have myself that are independent of anyone else's things that they've said to me. I don't think I'm psychopathic and can't pick up on the emotions of others, and I think I'm...
Probably wouldn't be here if you were.
Yeah, and I think I'm very diplomatic. Yeah. But I think being diplomatic is separate from being high emotionally intelligent.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So...
Yeah, I just, when I think of emotional intelligence, I think of... of course, it's a person's ability to kind of understand the situation, kind of.
So wait, you say of course, and I don't think this is something that's. I don't think a definition of emotional intelligence is clear and obvious. So I think maybe I would like to hear a little bit more before you say, like, oh, of course it's this. Like, what is emotional intelligence to you? How would you define it?
Well, I would define it as a person's ability to, like, read a situation and give the appropriate response that other people recognize, or that, like, a majority of people recognize as, like, this is appropriate, right? Like, I feel like...
Well, and I think, so I definitely agree with you that people that are highly emotionally intelligent can do that, but I don't necessarily think it has to be gauged on appropriateness. Like, I think emotionally intelligent people can do that and can read a situation and say, if I respond in this way, these other people will respond in way A. If I respond in this other way, these people will respond in way B. And maybe I want, in fact, to solicit response C from these people. So I need to do this third action, right? And they can think that through, and not only do they have thoughts about what each of those responses are going to be, they're very accurate in those responses, right? And so, and they also understand the average person will respond this way. However, my girlfriend, who I know very well to be not average, will respond this other way, right? So not only are they good at the typical person will do this, they're also attuned to each individual that they know really well to say, that response works great for these 5 people, but that response is horrible for my girlfriend, right? Or whatever. So if I were to define emotional intelligence, it has similar tones as what you said about being able to perceive the emotional state of other people, but also being able to predict the emotional state accurately of other people when faced with a certain stimulus, right? So yeah, read a room, read a situation, both in terms of what's happening right now, but also in terms of future things that haven't necessarily happened yet.
And I think that also, like, the way we kind of define it also, like, kind of hints at, like, our personalities. Like, you're very much of a plan, organize things out. And I'm very much of a, like, keep everything as calm and, like, relaxed as possible. So whenever, like, I react to a situation, I'm thinking of how can I keep this calm and relaxed. And you're thinking, like, how can I predict all of the different outcomes that will happen?
That's a great point. That is a great point. But I mean, I do think that, right, like, when I said at the beginning, I notice people that are highly emotionally intelligent and ones that aren't, like, I think it's a lot easier to recognize in, like, if you yourself are not the best at it. Like, you're operating at this normal level, and then you come into contact with someone that's, like, on a whole nother plane, and you're like, oh man, you know, like, it's very obvious. So, like, I tend to notice how other people are, but you are naturally more good at it, so I'm not sure that it, like, I'm not sure it's something you just assume everyone can do, because you can do it so well.
Oh, I definitely don't assume people can do it, and...
And of course you don't, because you have this emotional IQ and you can tell that other, like, you're aware of how other people are going to respond. So yeah, I think it is really interesting, people's ability to do that. So do you have any other thoughts on the definition of emotional intelligence?
No, I think that was kind of my definition. So how would you say, like...
so I guess I'm not done with the definitions. Because going back to your definition, you were saying the appropriate response. And again, I think that's a reflection of your personality. You like to keep things calm, diffuse the situation. So what would, for this group of people, be the most appropriate response to maintain that calmness, everybody's doing well, right? Which might be the most appropriate, but depending on your goals or whatever you're trying to accomplish, you may not want the most appropriate response. You may want to inflame people. Maybe you want to keep everybody really chill. Like, that's your goal. So anyway, I think that you noticed how my definition played a large role, like my personality played a large role, and I think yours does too. So anyway, so go ahead with the next.
So my next question kind of like, so how would you say that, like, you said intelligence earlier is something that like you were kind of born with. And I could, so I somewhat agree with that, but I also think that like your environment has, like, I would say it's 60-40 in terms of
I would agree.
environment,
like, I think you're
born with versus environment.
Right. Like, I think you can be taught skills to increase your intelligence. Like, you start out with some, and you can be taught to increase.
Yes.
But I do think that not everybody is born starting out with the same amount.
Yeah.
And I also feel that you can be taught certain skills to increase your intelligence, and for some people, that will increase it a little bit, whereas for other people, it will increase it a lot. Like, some people are more efficient at implementing those skills.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
So, where do you see, like, emotional intelligence on that spectrum? Because I would say, like, regular intelligence, it's like 60-40. Like, you're born, it's natural, versus 40% kind of your environment. But I would definitely say that, like, emotional intelligence is probably a little bit more like 80-20.
In terms of you're born with it, 80%.
Yeah, and then like your environment kind of.
And maybe again, this is coming from me, who perceives herself to have a slight deficit in the emotional intelligence category, feeling like it would be more like 40-60. Like, I feel like you can be taught, if you are observant enough and care to think about and notice and remember, that you can increase your emotional intelligence more than I feel like you can increase your regular intelligence, like problem-solving intelligence.
Yeah.
But again, maybe that's my wishful thinking, right? Like, I can improve, but maybe not. So it's interesting that you feel like emotional intelligence is more locked in genetically, you're born with it, than regular intelligence, and I feel the opposite.
Well, I think it has like a lot to do with, like, just for me personally, like my background and like growing up, like I feel like I have experienced like a lot of different, like, either seen or been a part of like a lot of different like on the emotional spectrum. Like, I've been from really, really sad to like really, really happy.
And you think like the normal person hasn't?
No, I think the normal person has. I just think that, like, and no, I don't know. Like, I just think that I just know for myself personally that, like, I feel like I have experienced a large spectrum of the emotional, a large part of the emotional spectrum, and it's kind of went back and forth, like. And while like my personality may have stayed like in the center, and I tried to keep things calm, like, I think I've recognized that like I've been at different ends of the spectrum. But I think that is part of where like my emotional intelligence has come from, and like that 20%. But I think like because of like my natural like inclination towards it, like it's helped me be able to like recognize and understand and kind of why I have like.
Yeah, and so I think you hit on something really interesting. Like with regular intelligence, I think I said earlier, problem-solving intelligence. Because I think that's how I kind of define like raw intelligence. Like when faced with a new situation you've never seen before and a new problem of any type, like can you figure it out? I do think that like we talked about, you can increase your natural ability with different skills, and one way you can increase it is just by practicing, right? If you're exposed to more different things, you might, you know, and
more familiar with it.
Yeah, and kind of like you said, because, or maybe this is what I heard you to say, let's see if I interpreted it correctly, but I thought you were trying to say that because you've experienced such a wide range of emotions, that has led you to have a deeper emotional IQ.
Yes, that is what I was saying.
Yeah, and so to me that's kind of that same concept of like practicing, right? Like you just happen to be a very observant and introspective person. So I think a lot of people, like I was kind of asking you, do you think you're the only one that's had this wide range of emotions? No. A lot of people experience this range of emotion, but they may not be as introspective or observant about what they do when they're feeling that emotion, or how they portray it or how they feel. So I think that because you are observant and you are introspective, you have a better appreciation for the behaviors that go along with the feeling, and therefore you can recognize the behaviors in others and can link the feeling, right? Whereas people like me that may not be as observant about those things, and I feel like I'm decently observant and pretty introspective, but for other people, maybe myself included, maybe not, but they may have a less ability to link a behavior to the feeling, right? It's easy to observe this person is acting this weird way, but the emotionally intelligent person can be like, and that's because of this. Whereas the person lacking emotional intelligence is like, no idea, they're just hysterical, illogical, like all the things, right? So I think that key is being able to link the behavior with the emotion. And I do think that experiencing different emotions helps you develop this emotional IQ. Like I think most toddlers, part of growing up is developing your emotional IQ.
Yes, and maturing,
Yeah, so I think that, different toddlers might be born with more or less of it, and you can pick up on that. Like some toddlers will notice when mom's upset, right, and give her a hug. Whereas other toddlers, like, it's right over their head. And maybe that's just because it's important to different things are important to different people.
Yeah. I think it also goes kind of back to what you were saying earlier, like the relationship that you have with somebody, and like specifically with a toddler or like a young child, like maybe the relationship they've cultivated, like naturally their emotional intelligence might not be as high, but because of the relationship they have with their mother or their significant other, they're able to like say, hey, this person needs a hug right now.
Right. Well, you can also understand that it could be a survival thing. Like imagine if you're in a home where parents being stressed out might mean you're witnessing violence, or might mean you don't get food, right?
Yeah.
And so you might learn to be much more attuned into parents' emotional state because it directly affects you in a much more visceral way than a child that is not experiencing that. That's not to say that a child not experiencing that might not also pick up on these emotional states, but they may not develop this behavioral response to do something about it. And maybe they do because that's just how they are, right? So like, I think that shows the spectrum, kind of like you were saying, there is an environmental component, but there's also a genetic component. That's just how different people are. Like my mom tells me all the time that Jeffrey is the most emotionally sensitive and in tune of her 4 kids to at least to her emotions, right? And so she always talks about how whenever she's upset, Jeffrey's the first one to notice, and Jeffrey's the first one to do anything about it. And I think a large part of that is probably true, but I also think, is Jeffrey really the first to notice? Or is he the first person to try to do something about it? Like, maybe the rest of us all notice it and feel like we can't do anything. Or maybe some of us notice and feel that we just don't care to do anything, right? Like, I doubt that that's the case, but it's a possibility, right? Like, there's all sorts of different possibilities, but I know that my mom perceives that Jeffrey's the first person to notice and the first person to do anything about it. And I imagine that she perceives he's the first to notice because she perceives he's the first to do anything.
Yeah.
And I just find that interesting, right? Because I don't like, I feel like I notice when my mom's upset, right? And I also feel like I do something about it when she's upset, and my feelings aren't hurt in any way to hear her feedback. It's just curious to me because I'm like, like, I wonder what Jeffrey's doing differently.
Yeah.
And, you know, she'll talk about things like giving her hugs or, like, cuddling her or whatever, and, I don't feel like I neglect to do those things, right? So it's just very interesting how that's her perspective. And I also don't think it's necessarily wrong, because I do think that, like, I notice myself that I feel like Jeffrey does a lot more behavioral things to foster an intimate relationship with my mom.
Yeah.
So the whole observation is just really curious to me, you know, and I'm curious what Jeffrey's perspective is. Like, you know, does he agree? Does he feel like he does anything specially on purpose? Or is he just like, I never noticed that. I just happen to be a caring, empathetic person, right? Or is it like, I intentionally do this because of the
relationship,
Right, yeah. So, you know, and I'm curious as to what Rob and Hunter's perspectives are. Like, do they agree? Do they feel like they do nothing? Do they feel like they do this stuff that's not perceived by mom? You know, like, all sorts of things.
It's all on the spectrum of like, your perspective.
Yeah. And I'm curious what Scott's perspective is, right? Like, does he agree? You know, and so the whole thing is just very interesting to me. And when you just said, you know, this is what I want to do for the topic this month, like, my first thought went to this topic of my mom's observation about Jeffrey being the most attuned to her emotional state. So yeah, very interesting. So would you, I think I've made it very clear how I feel about my emotional intelligence and how I feel about yours. What are your opinions on your emotional intelligence and my emotional intelligence? And it doesn't have to be like in relation, I'm just curious. Like,
I think that
like, do you agree with my assessment of you, or do you feel like it's misplaced, or I'm lowballing you and you're way more emotionally intelligent than even I give you credit for? You know, like, I'm curious what your perspective is.
So, do we have to worry about the timer going out?
Yeah, but it's only been 20 minutes.
Okay, how long do we have?
10 minutes.
Okay. Well, I know you didn't set a timer, so I was like...
Yeah, that's okay. It's because my phone goes off, so...
Okay.
That's okay.
Alright, so... Well, my emotional intelligence, like... I would not give it as much credit as you give it. I think that...
My humble guy.
I don't know how humble I am, but I would just say that, like...
In this one area.
I just think for, like, the majority of my life, like, I feel like, especially when I was younger, like, there may be, like, situations that I definitely, like, didn't deal with as well. I remember there was one, like, fight with my grandmother that I had where I just, like, it was just an emotional outburst at her, and I was yelling at her, and she was yelling at me, and she was yelling at me, and I look back on that, and I'm just like, what was I doing? Like, I didn't mean any of the things that I said. Like, I was just angry. It wasn't, like, necessarily anything that she was doing. I was just
like,
angry.
You weren't even angry at her, per se. Yeah.
And I just look back on these, like, situations, and maybe even, like, for some, like, to a lesser degree, maybe some, like, some of the things ways I treated my siblings when they were younger. And it's just, like, all of these situations, like, if I could, like, have them to go back and, like, cultivate, like, these relationships maybe, like, a little differently, I would. And so, like, with that and kind of as like the backdrop of my, like, emotional responses to things, I always want to, like, try and make sure that I'm always managing my emotions.
Mm-hmm. And I think you told me that before too. Like, growing up, you had a distinct time in your life where you made a conscious volitional choice to work on that.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it wasn't like something in your subconscious that you just got better at over time. It was like, consciously, I'm choosing to respond more instead of react.
Yeah.
You know, like, consciously, I'm going to choose going forward from here on out to try to take a breath and then respond logically, as opposed to letting my emotion dictate my behavior, right?
Yeah, and I think, like, I kind of have a story to go along with this. I
would love to hear this story.
My cousin Tamika, who is now passed away, shout out to her son Nigel. Hey Nigel, if you ever watch this. But
speaking of emotionally intelligent, I feel like Nigel calls you a lot and is very just interested in maintaining the connection.
Yes. And I'm interested, yeah, we are definitely like,
I'm always impressed with him that
each other.
he does that, right, for such a young child. And he's not that young anymore, but he's not in high school or anything.
No.
So
he's not even in middle school yet.
Yeah, so I think that's great that anyway, I'm very excited.
We are, like, me and Tamika, we're probably like somewhere like early middle school, intermediate school. But like we were all at my grandma's house. Like Mika was at her house. Which they were neighbors at the time.
Wait, is this a fitting story?
Yeah. And so, like, we were outside playing, and for some reason, like, I decided to hit Mika. And, like, I hit her, and, like,
Roughly how old were you? We were, like, elementary school
probably, like,
age?
7, 8. Somewhere between 7 and 10.
Okay, so elementary school age.
Yeah. So I hit her.
And she was a couple years older than you?
Yeah, she's probably 2 years older than me.
Okay.
I think maybe a year. But it doesn't matter.
And yeah.
So like I like hit her and she turns around and like punches me in my nose. And I get a bloody nose and I go crying to my grandma. I'm like, Grandma, like Mika hit me and like my nose is bleeding. And I think like
fails to mention I hit her first.
Yeah. Of course, that's always how the story goes.
Yeah.
And of course, like, she comes back and she's just like very matter of fact, like, you hit me first. My daddy told me if like somebody hits me, then I'm allowed to hit them back. And like, I think I learned there 2 lessons. Like, first of all, I'm probably not a very good fighter.
Yeah. Run away.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't running away. It was just like you've tried to fight somebody. And then, like, they punch you in the nose and you lost. Like, this fighting thing is probably not for you. Since I probably, like, I'm only going to fight if I need to. And if I need to, it's going to be in a dire situation. So, like, I'm not going to have to run away. Or even if I do have to run away, like, I'm able to take a lick.
Yeah.
And so, don't fight somebody unless you're ready to take a lick.
Great lesson.
So it was a lesson that was learned very early and one that has stuck
with you to this day. What other lesson did you learn?
I would say that just the other lesson that I learned was just that, like, how you like treat people and like also just like your response. Like, I don't know why I hit her, like what my reasoning was for hitting her.
Sure.
But like I probably wasn't like warranted or like justified in hitting her. And so like my actions led to like her hitting me.
Right. Well, and also even if you were, let's say, quote unquote, did it fix whatever the problem? Do you know what I mean? Like, let's say you felt like she was doing something awful, right? Did you hitting her like stop her from doing that awful thing?
No, probably not in that situation. Like, she wouldn't hit me if it did.
Right. And so I think that's another lesson too of like, okay, if I want to elicit the response I want from somebody, this isn't the method to do it.
You know, like, I understand what you're saying, that like, if you do this response, like, and you're the biggest, the baddest, like, or if you do this response and you won't get the, like, if you react this way, you're not going to get the response that you want. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times, or at least I've learned through my experiences, that if you're the biggest and you're the baddest, then you can definitely, like, through methods of violence or through methods of overpowering someone, you can get, like, the reaction that you want.
Or, like,
so,
you get by fear and intimidation, right?
Yes,
you're the
by
biggest
fear, yes.
By
fear and
biggest and strongest, like, you get your way.
Yes. And also, I would say that, like, if, like, I learned the lesson through, like, my interaction with Tamika, like, that you shouldn't be out here, like, fighting people unless, but I, like, through other interactions, or that I wasn't a good fighter. I will say that was the biggest. I am not a good fighter. So
you're not built for fighting.
No. But, like, just that, like, but through other lessons, I also learned that if you're the biggest and the baddest, or the strongest, not necessarily baddest, I wouldn't necessarily, there's been a lot of times where I wouldn't say that I'm the baddest, but I've definitely been, like,
biggest and strongest.
The biggest and strongest. And so, like, if you're the biggest and the strongest, through the methods of intimidation or fear,
threat of violence or violence
you can
itself.
definitely get, like, you can invoke the response that you want.
And I agree with that. And it may not be an authentic response, right?
Yeah.
They're just scared into doing whatever it is.
Yes. Which is, in any relationship, it's not the, like, type of, you don't want to coerce someone into, like, having that response.
And I think that's a great word to put. It's a method of coercion. And I wasn't trying to say that, like, violence is always bad. Like, I do think in general, you know, I'm a pacifist, but, like, I do think in general violence is not the answer. But sometimes I think there are select scenarios.
Yeah.
But what I was really trying to say is that, like, violence aside, maybe one method you learned was, like, to get this response from Tamika, this method of eliciting, like, this method wasn't working, right? The method that you had chosen. So that reminds me of another thing that my mom taught me one time, and I think I was in middle school or high school, and I remember distinctly, like, at the time that she said this to me, feeling both, like, I understand, like, I had life experience to understand what she was saying, but also feeling like that's kind of an awful sentiment. But now looking back, I think at the time I just had like, she was using words that at the time I interpreted to be more severe than she intended. And so what she said to me was, like, sometimes you have to behave in certain ways specifically so you can manipulate other people. And I had that thought of, like, that makes sense. When I scream at my brothers, right, it doesn't change their behavior. When I'm, you know, ask nicely, you know, or give them some incentive, like, if you would please stop doing this, I will please stop doing, you know.
Yeah.
It works a lot better, right? Like, it works a lot better in changing their behavior, right? At the time I thought, like, geez, like, manipulate people, like, who wants to be out here manipulating people? Like, I'm not trying to be some puppeteer manipulating people, like, and that's where I think I just thought she meant manipulate in a much more severe way, but I think what she was trying to say was just, in normal everyday life, you have to learn to get along with people, and you're not always going to get your way, and, you know, sometimes, though, if you would like to...
Yeah, if you're nice to somebody, they're more likely to, like...
Yeah, like, you're not always going to get your way, but sometimes you can...
Control your actions.
Yeah, you can control your actions to give you a much better likelihood of getting what you want, right? And, I mean, I think that goes a long way in negotiations, in regular relationships, right? There's tons of ways in which we behave with other people that you're actively trying to change the status quo. Like, you're trying to get a different behavioral response from them.
Yes.
And I think that's normal and constant, right? It's not like you trying to be manipulative. That's just a normal thing. And so I think what she said was really insightful. So yeah, and I think that also plays, in order to do that successfully, like what my mom was talking about, you have to have a high emotional IQ. EQ, we could say.
EQ.
Yeah, so have there been times, like, is there a specific instance that you experienced that led you to think, like, oh, maybe I have a high EQ? Or that you noticed somebody else with a high EQ?
there was like, and it's kind of like, it's kind of a catch-22 because this person, the situation that I was like, this person is one, very intelligent.
Like regular intelligence.
Like regular intelligence. Because like they understood like, how do I ask this question in order to not like, to not make the person like upset. I'm really interested in this question, and I want to do it in a non-threatening way.
Well, see, to me, that's not regular intelligence at all. That's like the definition of emotional intelligence.
But like, I would not, and I very rarely try to like, unless I just like know you like
really
like
well.
Yeah, unless it's someone like you and we have that relationship, like I'm not very readily to say like this person like has EQ. I can tell if somebody is smart, and like I can pretty regularly like do that. But like to say like EQ, I'm not ready to like say.
You need a lot of observations to come to that conclusion.
I need a lot of data points.
Okay, fair enough.
And so I would not say I've had enough like data points with this person
to make the
observation.
Sure.
But I definitely made the observation that the person is like brilliant, and like they were able to ask this question, which I was wanting to know the exact same I wanted to know the exact same answer to the question, but didn't know how to like ask it in a non-threatening way. And I was like, shit, like he is.
You were just blown away.
I was like, oh my god, like what a guy. Like,
so are we allowed to? Do you feel comfortable telling us what the question was, or is that going to give away who it is, and you're trying to protect people's privacy?
Well,
Can you explain the situation?
The question was just like.
Because I'm like super curious now. Like I want to know this.
The question was just like what are the possibilities or like future goals for like your children, and they have like both girls and boys, and so they were very conservative people.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Like, yeah.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I was there at that dinner.
You were.
Yeah.
And so the question is the question was just like what are the possibilities for like your daughter or your children?
Yeah.
Because the future of your children.
Yes.
Yeah. And it was just very interesting to like have the question. Like, it wasn't phrased that way, but the question was just asked.
That was the spirit of the question. Yeah. And it was phrased so. I feel like we can explain a little more in detail.
I mean, you can feel free to.
You don't feel comfortable. You don't think I should.
I don't need to, but like if you want to.
I would like to, if that's okay. So I agree with you that this person is objectively very intelligent, of regular intelligence. But we were having an interesting discussion with some people that I would classify as acquaintances of ours, right? So we knew them through someone else, but they were really good friends with that someone else, and we were also really good friends with that someone else.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where we don't know them that well, but like if there were to be an altercation, that would be like an issue for that middle person that we're good friends with, and that they're good friends with, and that's just not a good look. So not that there's going to be an altercation, but I think everyone that knows me knows that I'm very feminist and very pro women can do anything, and that some of the gender roles in society I find limiting. That would be my perspective. And so we were having this discussion with an individual that disagreed with me, I think, in that part, and it was just very interesting. And I think we all wanted to know, like, do you really think that this is all that your daughter can, like, all that she can amount to, right? Like, there's a million possibilities she could do, and you're limiting her to, like, you're constraining her to this one particular thing, right? But there's no way to have asked that question without sounding exactly like I sounded, like, I think you're a sexist jerk, right? Like, there was no way to ask that question, in my opinion, without coming across that way. So I didn't ask that question, right? You didn't ask this question. Along comes like fifth person that you're absolutely right phrases that exact question in a super like diplomatic, non-partial, like neutral way that in no way gave the impression like we think you're a sexist jerk, right? And it was amazing, right?
Yeah.
And it furthered the discussion, and we were able to like get this other person's opinion, and it was super enlightening. And I totally agree with you. Like at that moment, I also had like the conscious awareness of like, dang, that was like really well done. But yeah, I definitely, when I observed that scenario, to me that was one of those things that I was like, oh, check that box, high emotional intelligence. Huh. Even though I already knew from prior conversations with this other individual that they had a high like problem-solving intelligence. And so to me that was such a nuanced and finessed situation that I only needed that one data point.
Yeah.
Right? You know, like I didn't need a bunch of other data points. Yeah. But I definitely agree with you, and like you've probably had more interactions with this person than I have. But I can see how even like you would feel that you've had limited interactions with this person to make that assessment. But yeah, and I think that is a perfect example of what I define emotional intelligence to be, right? Is he was able to recognize I want to solicit behavior from this person. The behavior is for them to tell me more about their opinion. But I recognize that if I say, like, there's a whole bunch of things I could say that's going to make them feel attacked, threatened, and they're going to get defensive, may not give me that response, but also may say or do other things that socially, when I'm at this event with a bunch of people, would cause like even other things that I don't want, right? So like there's one level of I don't want them to not tell me this answer, but beyond that I really don't want this to become like a frictional thing in this fun social outing. And so that for him to recognize all of that, I think a lot of people can do that part. And just like you and I were saying, like we were just like, okay, you know, like ready to change the topic or ready to like whatever. And it takes that next level of emotional intelligence to be able to come up with the phrasing of the question in the way that they did, right? Because I definitely agree that there's a lot of people that can recognize like, ooh, this is about to be cringeworthy, or like, ooh, don't say that, do not say that, like change the topic. Yeah. So I think a lot of people have that ability, and that's why it was so impressive for this individual to do what they did in terms of their word choice, and also to like instantly do it, right? It's not like later on they were talking to us and they're like, I wish I would have said this, right? So yeah, I totally agree. I had a similar, another instance where I kind of was like, dang, like you are very emotionally intelligent, was actually at the gymnastics gym with Mitch, where one parent and one gymnast like behaved in a certain way, and Mitch was like, oh, well, blah, blah, and he like started telling to me, he's not like talking to anyone other than me, but he's telling me like, this parent is upset about this, and this child is doing this, and blah, and all these things that I'm like, I know there's practice 4 days a week, and I'm only here twice a week, so maybe I missed some of this, but like, you're describing a whole lot of things that I have not observed whatsoever, right? And I'm listening. It's not that I don't believe him. I'm just like, I have no independent observation of this, right? And it's like, lo and behold, the very next day I'm there, the parent comes up to me and is like telling me all this stuff about like why they're upset and why their child is upset. And it's like bang on exactly what Mitch had told me the day before, or like 2 days before. And I'm just like, how did Mitch know all of this stuff? Like from these, like, he was like, well, because this happened and this happened. And I'm like, you can't extrapolate these like from those two behaviors. Like, I'm like, sure, maybe, but there's also like these 5 other things that could be, right? But Mitch had just known this individual, like they had been coming to the gym for quite a while, and had known their parents, right? So he knew that for these two particular individuals, these behaviors indicates this. And I did not know them as well. But again, like, I was amazed because I'm like, okay, like, you're describing to me all these things, and I kind of see those behaviors, but sure, I guess it could indicate what you're saying, but it could also indicate these a bunch of other things. And so for him to know so quickly, and, like, he was convinced. Like, he had conviction that this is the reason, right? Whereas I'm, like, trying to talk him off this ledge of, like, it could be all these other things, right? And so for me to come back the next time I'm in the gym 2 days later, and the parent to be telling me, and, like, she's also telling me, I haven't yet talked to Mitch about this, but here's how we're feeling, right? And it's, like, all the exact thing. I'm like, is this a mind trap? Like, is this deja vu, and it's coming from a different person? Like, she's saying the exact things that Mitch was saying, and I'm just like, dang, like, how did he know? You know, like,
his EQ was off the charts.
Yeah, and I do think that that's something that makes him so successful at what he does. So anyway, that was just another one of those times where I was just, like, blown away. And I also feel like I had observed, like, similar things that he was saying in other families and other individuals. Like, partly that's why I had so much confusion about it, because I'm like, well, when so-and-so and so-and-so does this, you're not coming to these conclusions, right? And so, to me, it was one of those things where he happened to know those two people so well.
The connection, like, enhanced the emotional intelligence.
So it was just really interesting. And I'll never forget that. You know, it's one of those things that's so astounding. You, like, remember it forever, right?
Well, it's funny, like, I've definitely gotten to, like, an emotional connection level to, like, where I can kind of, like, I would say with, like, Patrick, for instance, like, he can say something, and I'll be like, all right, this is what he means, like, hey, like, it's time to, like, start moving things around, or he'll get a look, and I'll be like, all right, but that's because of, like, our connection and, like, how much time we spent together.
Right.
And I also would say that, like, there may be people that, like, I spent a bunch of time in college with that, like, I don't spend anywhere near as much time with now. That, like, once upon a time, like, our EQ connection was, like, very strong, where now it's like, when we see each other, we're still, like, good friends, but it's not at that same level that it was before.
But would you say, like, you still feel like you could read them as well? Like, I understand that you're saying we don't have as much intimacy because we're not able to spend as much time together. But, like, let's say you were to see a meme on the internet, like, would you know instantly, like, oh, so-and-so would think exactly this about this meme, even though I haven't, spoken to them in 3 years? Or does that diminish for you because you haven't spoken in 3 years?
I think if it's, like, something that, like, we connected over, or, like, if it's a song or something from back when we were, like, friends, but, like, if it's something new, like a new meme or a new, like, situation, I think it's very, like, I would be very hard pressed to say, like, this is how they would think about, like, this, like, meme or something new in 2020. Where if it was something from, like, 2007, I could send the, like, group text and be like, hey, and everybody would get, like, everyone would have an emotional response to it. Mm-hmm. But if I sent, like, a meme from, like, 2020 to the chat, they were like, maybe one or two people would be like, oh, like,
yeah, or they might find it funny, but it wouldn't be as, like,
connected.
An inside joke. Yeah. Interesting. Huh. So what are some ways that you think that people can improve their emotional intelligence?
I got no clue. Like, I really think the only way to, like, improve your emotional intelligence is to be in, like, a bunch of emotional situations. Where, like, honestly, like, I feel like you have to, like, push your emotions, like, when you're feeling sad, like, identify, I feel sad, like, I feel happy, or, like, it's kind of like mindfulness.
Just
and
being
that,
very observant.
yeah, and like kind of like taking in the moment, realizing like the emotion that you're like feeling, and just like an awareness of your emotions. I feel like this whole year, to kind of sum it up, on this podcast we've tried to like impress upon people that like your emotions, like you need to have an awareness of them, and it's good to explore them. And I think that is like ultimately the way that like you grow your emotional intelligence, by like looking inside yourself and like understanding your emotions, how you're feeling, and then hopefully like you get to a point where like you can talk about them with like people. And I think that would be my like suggestion on how to like improve your emotional intelligence. But like I have no idea. That is just me throwing up something against the wall and hoping it sticks. How would you suggest improving your emotional intelligence?
Well, I think so. What I was gonna say kind of is similar to what you were saying, but to me, it's more of like in a simulated environment. And what I mean by that is, so I'll just say it, and it'll make a lot more sense. But it's to read. And I used to always say, like as a kid, to some of my friends that also love to read books, like, you know, we've lived 100 lives because we've read all these different books. And when you're reading a book, you know, the characters are going through stuff, and it's often like very emotionally charged. Mm-hmm. But you get the benefit of seeing not only how they respond and what the stimulus is, but you get kind of extra insight into their mind and what the backstory is, so you can better understand why that thing triggered them so much, or why that was so upsetting, or whatever. And you know, it's like one of those things where, you know, you're reading it and you're 10 years old, and it's just a story, but it feels pretty damn real to you. You know, like I'm the orphan that's getting shipped off or whatever, and you're thinking about it later, and for the next 3 weeks as you're trying to go to bed, like all this stuff. But you know, so I think maybe that's just me and my imaginative personality, that when I read stuff, I get really into it. But I definitely think that reading allows you to kind of simulate those emotional experiences without you actually being the orphan, you know, or you actually having this terrible thing happen, or this amazing thing happen, or whatever it happens to be.
And that it's like a great point. Like in 2020, I feel like I've read so much more than in any other year in my life.
I would agree with
that.
But
like I've also like, I feel like I've been able to like not necessarily share in the experiences of that other people have been through, but I feel like I have like a connection, and an understanding without like being there, without like growing up with them, but like I feel like I have an understanding of a deeper understanding of what their life was like. And in a little ways, that's probably like increased my emotional intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, that's my point exactly, right? Yeah. And I think different people may not prefer the medium of reading. Like I get much more into it when I'm reading versus when I'm watching like a TV show, but I think other people may be different from me and might get just as much out of watching a show, right? Like even if it's a comedy, it doesn't have to be some crazy drama or whatever, but there's always going to be emotionally charged instances, and there's always going to be times that you can see like, oh yeah, everybody would be upset in this scenario, or only this character is upset in this scenario, but you are privy to like the backstory to see why. And so I think that can kind of increase your emotional intelligence. And so whether it's from reading, or whether it's from watching shows or whatever, or even just listening to stories, talking to a grandparent, talking to a parent, talking to a friend, can help you kind of develop those types of things without firsthand experiencing it for yourself.
Yeah, and it kind of gives you like an emotional bank to like draw from.
That's a great way to put it.
But also thinking like along those lines of like having TV shows and like reading books, like that is why it's also so important for like representation, like gender representation, like sexual representation, religious, racial, like those representations matter, because like one of those things being different can completely like change the emotional response. Just like even like I feel like for some people that are like cisgendered, you don't think of like, oh, this is just how like a person responds in this situation. But like when you're a non-binary like gender, like your response to those situations might not be the same as somebody that's cisgendered.
Right, totally.
So like having that representation opens up like what the like emotional spectrum can be and what the emotional response can be to a situation.
Yeah, and I think that's a really insightful thing that you said, because not only is representation really important, for, like in your example, like a non-binary child, they see that or read about that normalizes it, right? They don't feel like I'm totally different from everybody, nobody understands me. It's like, oh, there are other people that are going through this, right? But it also allows those of us that don't have that as part of our identity to better understand what it might be like for them. Why are they responding this way? Why is doing this action so offensive or so helpful, right? Or, and I think that can be extended to all sorts of different things, like whether it's, financially, racially, like with your sex, your gender, like all these different things. But it allows you to kind of develop this sense of my experience isn't the only experience, right? And so I think just that first step of knowing there are other experiences, there are other ways of reacting, kind of opens the door to allowing you to develop this emotional IQ. Because I do think that one thing, at least I think about a lot, like in my example with Mitch, he was going from A to Z, and I'm like, I see the link there, but that wouldn't be the first place I would go, right? Because for me, like, I was operating under the, like, if I was behaving that way, how would I, like, what would that mean for me? And that would be A to B, not A to Z, right? And so it was hard for me to really think about any other alternative. But because these two individuals are not me, and they have their own life experience, and Mitch
is connected
to them and knows how they respond, it was very easy for him to go to A to Z, and it turned out to be right. So I think that, developing that awareness of, well, Hattie in this situation would act this way, that maybe most people would act this way, maybe not, right? But knowing that there are other alternatives, I think is a huge first step. And reading, watching shows, talking to people, listening to stories allows you not only to see there are other alternatives, but to see the reason behind them. Yeah. Right? Because
I would say also to, like, for people that, like, where they're not, like, the majority, to be able to connect. Because so much of being, like, a human being is, like, finding our connections and, like, how are we alike? And what's our shared experiences? And for some people, they're like, I don't share any experiences with anyone. And so, like, but they do. They just haven't found those people yet.
Right, or haven't found those experiences yet that they share. Yeah. I think that's great. So do you have any last thoughts?
I do not have any last thoughts. That's pretty much it on how I feel about emotional intelligence. What about you?
I don't have any last thoughts, but I did want to say this emotions theme for the past year has been really, really awesome. So I definitely, I think it surprised me and was a lot more insightful than I kind of expected it to be. I didn't expect it to be boring or anything like that, and I think some of our episodes have been more predictable, but I think we've had a lot of really good, interesting and insightful conversations. So I think great job on that theme, and
thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
But 2020, see you later. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. And we'll check you guys back in 2021.
Yep, so that's what we've been doing.
Stay safe. Deuces, everyone.